I just read one of my favorite booktubers debut, which is no other than Philip Chase's book, The Way of Idan, and I'll say it now, this was a very good book, but I do understand why it wasn't picked up by publishers. Now, let's talk about it. Also, if you wonder why I had a different background, there's no reason for it, I just wanted to mix it up. Now firstly, if you don't know who Philip Chase is, then firstly, you are missing out. Now Philip, he's one of the most genuine and thoughtful booktubers out there, and he actually has a PhD in literature, making him one of the more smarter people in our community, and I've been watching his channel since he literally was only at around 300 subscribers. So yes, I have been a fan of his channel for a while now. I also need to say the obvious. I would consider Philip a friend, and I've been on his channel a couple of times, so while I will be trying to be very unbiased, I just need to make it clear we are friends, so I might be a bit biased. Alright, let's get into this book review, and let's talk about firstly why I don't think this book was picked up by a publisher, and as you will probably realize, the reason I'm mentioning are not necessarily bad things, but more related to the story itself. Now, The Way of Idan reads and feels very much like your typical classic fantasy. It has many of the tropes we know from classic fantasy, such as this farm boy or small village boy suddenly having to leave everything behind to go on this quest. Now the story takes place in a medieval kind of setting, and then you have prophecies, you have a mentor, and you have the found family trope. You even have a very soft magic system, which is typical for classic fantasy, and then this book has several songs and a lot of scenes that take place in various inns. And then you have dwarves and you have elves, and then the prose feels like something you would probably expect from this type of story. Now I'll get more into the prose later, but it feels quite Tolkien-esque. Now there's no doubt about that this book was heavily inspired by The Lord of the Rings and the time periods Philip loves, such as the medieval periods. You get the gist. This book at its core is a classic fantasy, and there's no getting around it. Now that is not to say that any of those things I just mentioned are bad. Not at all. Actually, I think a lot of it is very well done in this book, which I'll expand on a bit more later on, but I just think that this is probably not a story publishers are looking for in today's market. If I went to a bookstore and picked up this book and I didn't know anything about the story or the author, and I saw that this book was published in 2023 by a well-known publisher, then I would be surprised. Now why do I say that? Because this is not the type of story I would expect to be published in the modern fantasy setting. Now if Philip had pitched this book to a publisher maybe 20 years ago, I do find it very likely that it would have gotten a publisher. And why do I say that? Simply for the reason that this is a very well written book. So let's talk about what I loved here before getting to some things that personally didn't work that well for me. Firstly, the first thing that really struck at me was how good the prose is. It is quite a feat to have your debut have this strong prose, if I'm being honest. Now, I don't really know what to compare the prose to here, but I saw Alan from the Library of Alexandria compare it to Tolkien's prose, and I think in some parts I would agree with that. I mean, the prose is beautiful and is filled with lots of descriptions, and Philip really knows how to set a scene. It is really an atmospheric read with lots of beautiful woven sentences, and as mentioned previously, songs play a big part in this story. Now, this is not your so-called modern prose with very little exposition or just straightforward sentences. It is clear Philip has a deep appreciation for the more flowery prose, I suppose you could say, but it fits with the story really well, which is definitely something that is worth praising. I mean, I just love when I pick up a book set in another world, and the prose allows me to experience that feeling of, yes, I'm actually not in our world anymore, and Philip, he really excels in that area. Now, secondly, what I love, and this is a bit more specific, but this is the type of book I would expect someone like Philip to write. Now, Philip's love for the classic fantasy genre and his love for both Norse and medieval literature and those time periods is so clear in this book, which really allows for a rich world building, and more importantly, you feel the love and effort the author has put into this novel to try to make it as good as possible. This book truly feels like an ode to everything Philip loves, which is really great. Now thirdly, the world building and exploration of themes is definitely something I need to talk about here. Now I've already mentioned that this is a classic fantasy at its core, but there are also things here that do feel fresh and different. For example, the elves in this book are absolutely horrifying and have this scary atmosphere around them. I mean, we don't get to see that much of the elves themselves in this book, but the little we do is really terrifying, and they are also crazy powerful. I also love that Philip has decided to hold off a lot of information related to the elves in the first book, because after finishing this book, I just felt, wow, the elves are so mysterious and scary, and I want to know so much more about them, which I always appreciate when an author knows when to withhold information in order to raise the stakes. Also, the dwarves, or the dvorks, is that how you pronounce it, are also great, and I can see a lot of readers will feel really bad for the dwarves in the series because their story in this world is truly tragic. Now, I'll not get into details because we get a whole backstory about them in the book, and you should just really buy this book and read it, but really, the backstory for the dwarves was really sad and tragic. And then we have the humans, and humans have divided themselves into various kingdoms, and the main players in this book is the Torland Kingdom, which is a kingdom led by zealous priests that worship Edan, and then outside of this kingdom you have kingdoms such as Adanon and Cargillion. I don't know if that pronunciation is correctly. And basically, the basic plot of the story is this. The kingdom of Torland is getting ready to invade various kingdoms in the name of their god, Edan, to try and establish this new and godly and holy kingdom on Earth. And then within this overarching plotline, we get to see a lot of friction between the main players and their different perceptions of religion and power and so on. And what I think this book really does well is to explore religion in a nuanced and complex way. Now, most of you know that I'm a Christian, and following Jesus is the most important thing in my life, no doubt about it. However, what I loved about this book is that I never felt that Philip misrepresented the different aspects of how religion is being used by people. In this book, you have people that don't care about the religion at all, but they act like they do because that will help them to gain favor with certain people. And then you have people that are so zealous that they actually lose the ability to critically think about certain things and are not able to adapt due to their blindness. Now, while we don't know much about the god of Edan yet, and whether he's a real god or a fake one, there are hints in this novel that there must be some supernatural power in control, because we see a prophecy come true basically, and prophecies are usually, at least in our context, a revelation from a god, right? So why do I mention it here? Well, it's because it seems like Philip is emphasizing here that the main issue with a lot of religious conflict today is not necessarily with the religion itself, but it's the humans that misrepresent it or use it to take advantage of people, which is obviously something we all should condemn. In a lot of ways, this book exploration of religion reminded me of books such as Illborn by Daniel T. Jackson or Elantris by Brandon Sanderson, and I always love when an author is not afraid to analyze complex themes such as religion in their fantasy books. And also doesn't just blatantly hate on religion. I mean, religion is complex, and we as humans all have different thoughts or experiences with religion, and I don't think it's fair to blatantly hate on religion or to say that everything about it is good. There are good and bad aspects to religion, and Philip seems to acknowledge that, which I really do appreciate. Now, what are some of the aspects I didn't love? Well, firstly, I didn't have any issues with the characters, but none of them blew me away. I mean, I thought they were all decent, but nothing crazy, but hopefully we'll see these characters grow more in book 2 and 3. Secondly, while this is a very well written book, I generally tend to appreciate when someone brings something new and fresh to the genre, and while there are some things in this book that do feel fresh, overall, this is a classic fantasy tale at its core, which again, is not a criticism, but the overall setting didn't make me feel overly excited, but this is very much a me thing. And thirdly, I thought the overall plot was great, but there is a part in the middle book where something happens which kinda felt like a filler plotline kind of thing. I mean, the good news is that while this event does alter where the story goes, I do really appreciate Phil's ability to bring everything together in the last act, and overall I did enjoy the conclusion. So what are my concluding thoughts on The Way of Edan by Philip Chase? Well, overall I think that this is a really phenomenal debut, and definitely a book you should consider picking up if you are a fan of Philip Chase, or if you are in the mood for a really solid classic fantasy. Now, this will not be a book for people that want something along the lines of Brandon Sanderson or Fonda Lee, for example, because this is very much not that. But if I should give this book a star rating, judging only by my enjoyment, I would probably give it 3.5 stars. But if I should give this a star rating based on the execution of the story, then I would probably give it 4.5 stars, because I don't really have any significant issues with this one, except that it's very much a classic fantasy, which is not a genre I read that much anymore. Nonetheless, I'm very excited to be continuing the series, and I would love to hear if you are planning on picking up this book or not. And as always, thank you so much for watching, and a special thanks to my patrons who support what I do here. I really appreciate it.